Just give me 1 second. Yeah, great. I've started the recording. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Avrilia. I'm the community manager at Impact Hub King's Cross, where we support social enterprises through events, business support programs, and a global community of more than 16,000 Impact members around the world. In terms of some quick logistics on the event today, you will see that everyone has been muted as a default option. You will not be able to unmute yourselves. However, we welcome all of you to use the chat as a way to discuss and ask questions. We will have 2 breaks, I think, during this event where we will try to pose as many questions as you have to Dan and to our speakers. We're also recording this session, so I would suggest if you have any issues with that, that you turn off your video. Other than that, we welcome that you all have your video on, as it encourages quite a good engagement between us. Briefly, I just want to introduce Food Talks, which is a series of events around our food systems, which we've been running for a few years. Food Talks is a partnership between the Food Ethics Council, Impact Hub King's Cross, Organico, and London Food Link, which is part of Sustain, the Alliance for Better Food and Farming. The theme for this year, which we chose a few months ago, is we're all emergency respondents now, and the aim was to discover how we can transform our food systems and act together to tackle the climate crisis, obesity, democracy emergencies, and now more urgently the COVID pandemic. Today we will explore how we can switch from emergency to recovery in our response, and on that note, I am going to pass it back to you, Dan.
Thank you, Avrilia. So just to build on Avrilia's points, I'll be moderating it with Avrilia, and also my colleague Anna Cura will be taking notes, and I'll come back to Anna at the end just to make a final point right at the end. As Avrilia said, please do comment either via social media or in the chat box, raise questions and comments as we go through. We've got a really exciting set of speakers who I'll introduce in a moment. We are recording this, so if you don't want to be, we plan to share this publicly afterwards, so if you don't want to be your face to appear, then please do close your cameras off, although we do love to see your faces. So the topic for today, as Avrilia said, we're thinking about from how we go from emergency to recovery, and this very much builds on the first online food talks we held last month, where we heard from a range of people, including T. Woods, Kath, many others that many of you will know well. And we started, that was very much about the short-term emergency response, which is critical at this time and remains crucially important now. But some of the points that came out from that discussion, we started thinking about the need to tackle that short-term emergency, but also not to entrench sort of models that don't tackle root causes. So instead to focus on resilience, hence the shift to what we're starting to talk about today, how we as a collective need to discuss what we mean by resilient food systems, and how we can make our food systems more robust and perhaps reorient onto a more sustainable, more resilient footing going forward. So that's very much the theme of today. We acknowledge the devastating impacts of COVID-19. There was a minute's silence not long ago, which many people observed. We don't in any way want to downplay the very serious impacts of COVID-19 that they're having on everyday lives, and including on people's access to food. I guess the point of today's discussion is not to downplay that, but to start to take a bit of a longer term perspective and think about how we can reorient, how we can build resilience, identify opportunities for positive change for our food systems amidst all this chaos, and how can we embed and make stick some of the better stuff, or inverted commas, good stuff, better stuff that we're seeing in terms of some of the amazing responses that are out there. Just very quickly, in terms of a run through of what we're going to see and who we're going to hear from today. In a moment, we'll hear from our first pair of speakers, Trewin Restorick, CEO of Hubbub. It's an amazing organisation, runs lots of environmental campaigns. I'll let him introduce, but he can talk a bit about what he's seeing, how things are shifting, drawing on some recent polling they've done and some of the actions that perhaps we should be taking. And then hopefully, if he's on the call, Henry Leveson-Gower, an economist who is the founder and CEO of Promoting Economic Pluralism. He's also the editor of Mint magazine. He also does policy stuff, but he's very much wearing his economist hat. So we'll hear from him about some things about the broader economic powers at play. There'll be opportunity for questions to feed in from the chat box. And then we'll hear from our next batch of speakers, so Pete Ritchie, who's the director of Nourish Scotland, also a member of the Food Ethics Council, from Jyoti Fernandes from Landworkers Alliance, and Professor Corinna Hawkes from Centre for Food Policy at City University of London. So we'll hear from those shortly. Before we do that, I just want to, I guess, invite you to participate yourselves. Because whilst we have to meet you, because there are so many of you, I want to get you, hear what you have to say, hear what your views are. And one way we'll do that is through Mentimeter. So you can either use a smartphone or on your browsers. In a few moments rather, I will share my screen, and then there's an opportunity for you to just answer a few questions. So I'll just open that up now. Hopefully, if you give me a thumbs up if you can see that on your screen properly. So hopefully can people see that on their screen? Yeah, fantastic. So it's very much optional. We'd love to know what people say. So if you have either a smartphone or on your browser, if you go to, as it says at the top, www.menti.com, and enter the code with no spaces needed, just 525262. Just going to ask you 3 or 4 quick questions to start with, so we get a flavour of views from in the room, and then we'll dive in and hear from the speakers. So menti.com, and use the code 525262. The first question is just to get a sense of the sector that you're working on. Are you in the world of academia, from business, NGO, policy, media, etc.? I'll just give you a few moments just to fill that in, and I'll skip forward to the next question. Thank you, all those filling in. So it looks like we've got, as we had last time, a strong NGO presence, but also quite a few from academia, which is great. Lots of other or interested individuals, a few from policy, some from business as well, which is brilliant. I'll just leave that for a few more moments, and I'll skip on to the next question, which is a geographic question. So I'll just give you 10 more seconds on that. All right, thank you. I'll close it there just to build on the next question. So, the question is a simple one, which is, where are you? And hopefully this will function properly. So there should be some options coming up in a moment. Okay, that's something strange happening with my screen, so bear with me a moment. Okay, we've got a technical issue. That's what I'll do is I'll stop the share and we'll get that, try and get back to that afterwards. So I'll just stop that for a moment. We'll go back in, we'll try and come back to that in a moment. The idea is, the point is I know we've got a lot of people from all different parts of the UK and some international as well. But we'll come back and try and give you opportunity to feed in some thoughts and what you're seeing in response to COVID-19 and how we can shift in a few moments. But what I'll do next is come on to our first pair of speakers who I've introduced already. So Trewin Restorick, CEO of Hubbub. And I just want to check with Avrilia if Henry has been able to join and access. I can see him there actually as a co-host. Fantastic. So we're going to hand over first to Trewin just for 5 minutes to give some reflections on, say, things that you're seeing, Trewin, feeding in some of the insights from your recent poll and survey. And so what are some of the practical actions that we can take if we do want to shift the footing and try and bounce back perhaps onto a different path? So Trewin, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Dan. Thank you for the introduction, and amazing to see so many participants. I hope you're all well. Just for background, so I run an environment charity called Hubbub, and our aim is to take sustainable messages to a mainstream audience. On food, we have a network of around 100 community fridges that we distribute perishable food to people who need it. We run seasonal food campaigns such as Pumpkin Rescue, reducing food waste at Halloween. We're running a food waste campaign with Norfolk and Suffolk County Council at the moment. We've invested in community kitchens, and we've also done quite a lot of campaigns around promoting healthier, more protein diverse diet. So we were super interested in the impact of COVID on the UK's eating habits. We think that the whole, one of the impacts of the virus is it's focused everybody's attention on food and things that they were taking for granted. They really no longer are. And we think that actually that focus is a good thing, because we inherently believe that the food system in the UK is not sustainable. It creates vast amounts of waste. We've got obesity, we've got people struggling to put food on the table. And we heard just recently that there could be huge amounts of waste from fruit because we haven't got enough people in this country to collect the harvest. So we think that there's a broken food system, and this actually could be a good opportunity to explore how we can create a more sustainable food environment going forward. So what we did was we did some public polling with 2,000 people with a company called Censuswide. They're cross-representative from the UK. The questions are people are self-choose. So we have to take it with a little bit of a pinch of salt in terms of what they're telling us. But I think the overall findings are fairly robust, and they certainly chime with a lot of evidence that we've heard from retailers, and also we've seen in the news generally. So I just wanted to go very quickly through what that showed us. The first thing that shouted to us was that we've got a very divided nation. So we found that 43% of respondents are very concerned about getting food on the table, the cost of food, the impact of COVID on their ability to feed their families and their households. And actually there was an age divide in that as well, in that younger people were more concerned. So it went to more than half the people under the age of 40 were very concerned about getting food on the table and the cost of food. So I think that's the first thing that came out was, for a lot of people, this is a crisis, and that needs to be resolved. Conversely, on the other side of the table, we found that 44% of respondents were saying that they were enjoying cooking more, that they liked being with their family, and they were enjoying learning new cooking skills. And again, there was a big diversity in age, in that younger people, more than half said they were really enjoying the experience of cooking. They were learning new skills, and those are skills that they were going to keep. So the lack of takeaways in restaurants has actually forced a lot of people to learn to cook, and younger people in particular seem to be enjoying that experience. There was lots of rumours when it all started that people were panic buying and that was going to create a lot of food waste. The results in the survey suggest that might not be the case, in that the majority of people said that they were creating less food waste, and that's because they were planning more, there was less plate waste, and they were controlling portion size a lot more. And a third of people said that they started to understand and were using their freezer more, and that's borne out from the fact that when the crisis hit, freezer sales jumped by 200% in 2 weeks. So a lot of people have gone out and bought freezers, and they say that they're using them more. When we asked what sort of food people were buying and where they were buying it from, 25% that they said that they were really concerned about the quality of food, and they were actually now trying to buy better quality food. A third were saying that they were using local suppliers much more than previously. And obviously there was a huge drop off in takeaway sales. So 43% said they were all ordering less takeaway food. What was interesting in terms of food habits was that the vast majority, over 80%, said that they were going to stick to a lot of the things that they were now doing. So in particular, milk delivery services, fruit and vegetable services, local butchers, corner shops, all of those things people highlighted was something that they're enjoying doing, and then they intended to stick with it when some sort of normality returns. So that was those are the main headings from the poll. So as I said, a really divided nation. In terms of what our takeout is from this, and I've been talking to politicians around this, I think the new watchword in terms of progression out of this crisis will not be sustainability, it'll be about resilience. So this government is increasingly talking about how do we create a more resilient system. I think that's interplayable with sustainability, but just in terms of the language we use when we engage with policymakers and think how we frame this discussion, I think we need to talk about a more resilient food system. That obviously involves cutting food waste. It involves a fairer system which gets sort of food to people who really truly need it. It's obviously about creating a more sustainable agricultural system that can cope with whatever Brexit throws at us in terms of immigration and in terms of the common agricultural policy. But there are things that we can probably build on if we're really clever about it. So people are clearly learning new skills. So will those stick when people go back to work when there's less time? Can we get those skills to stick? Can we build that diversity of habits, shopping habits, and sort of really get local producers much more involved in the mix? And can we create a more resilient food system where we're growing more in the UK and less dependent on imports? So I think that's really all I wanted to say. That was a snapshot. As I said, it was a poll which people, chose, sort of self-selected their answers. So we do have to take it with a slight pinch of salt, but I think it gives a really good flavour about what's happening out there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Trewin. That's fantastic to hear some of the ways that people are responding, more localized food, some more people cooking, growing, getting engaged in food, which is fantastic to see. And I see from the chat box that one or two people have asked about that, and there's someone shared the link on that. But when we send a write-up round afterwards, we can share relevant links, etc., to, for example, to that research. So thank you. What we're going to do now is go straight into to do think of your questions that you might want to feed in to Trewin and in a moment Henry. What we're going to do now is hear from Henry Leveson-Gower, who, as I said before, is founder and CEO of Promoting Economic Pluralism. So to kind of bring an economist's hat, which doesn't always get brought into these debates, and for me is really important. So to think, we had the financial crash back in, was it 2007, 2008? And lots of people at the time said we would rebound and be on into a greener footing, and it's debatable the extent to which that happened. So I guess over to Henry just to give a flavour of some of the economic powers at play and suggestions of perhaps what needs to change. So Henry, over to you.
Thanks very much, Dan, and thank you very much for having me on this really important webinar. Yes, briefly, we're trying to open up thinking about the economy, which has been very much dominated by particular standard ways of thinking about incentives, growth, and so on, and to open the conversation so we can innovate to address a lot of the challenges we're facing. And this is, my background shows our magazine, The Mint, where you can find a lot of this thinking. So, looking at where we're going economically is fraught with problems, given the huge amount of uncertainty, and anyone who makes predictions at this point is probably crazy. So with that, I'm going to make some predictions, as I've only got 5 minutes, and I couldn't go through all the possible different ways things could turn out. But my best guess at the moment is that we're facing 3 phases. One which you might call the coping phase, where we're going to be living with COVID-19 amongst us until there is some sort of medical solution, vaccine, treatment, etc. And it seems, looking around what the chief medical officer, others are saying, that that's somewhere in the region of 9 months, year, 18 months, depending on, there's loads of uncertainties about whether we can actually create a vaccine, or treatment, but obviously a huge amount of resources and effort is going to be put in to try and address that. But it's going to take some time. Then the next phase, I've sort of called the transition, which is the period during which the vaccines potentially are rolled out globally. Now, from what I've read, the suggestion is that that takes another year. So just because you've got a vaccine doesn't mean it's out there everywhere. And obviously some parts of the world will get it quicker than others. There'll be huge competition or collaboration to get it out there. And then we're into recovery, because by that time it seems, we are going to effectively have a depression through repression of the economy, and that is probably going to break down a lot of the sort of economic financial structures and mean that when we eventually come out to something that might be called the new normal, we will be in a deep, probably, some people are saying a very deep recession, i.e. with very high unemployment, structural unemployment, due to the lack of jobs to go back to. So none of that obviously sounds good, but as ever, we as humans have this ability to try and at least find some positives in these challenging times, and that's sort of what I'm going to have to do. So really trying to think about the transition recovery at this point is probably very difficult, but thinking about what the coping phase might look like is probably worthwhile, and what we can achieve in that time will probably spill over to the next phases after that. So if we can get some positives during the next year, that maybe will make things better in the future things. So in terms of the coping phase, firstly, I think there are going to be risk-based restrictions, which will have different impacts on different sectors. So if you take the food sector, probably agriculture will have least restrictions. It's got space, probably social distancing is relatively easy, and obviously food is essential. Processing factories, less easy, but still probably possible. Then you compare that to restaurants, bars, which could be shut, I would, for some time, because the suggestion is that if you did social distancing in a restaurant or bar, you could not make it economic because you wouldn't have enough people there for a start. But overall, food sector relative to a lot of other areas of the economy is probably going to do relatively well, because at least the demand for food will continue, whereas lots of other parts of the sector of the economy won't have demand. So in a way, I think a lot will be called on the food sector because it will be doing better compared to other areas. During this time, I think there will be ongoing debate and revision over the whole support package, the nature of benefits, and because if people are going to follow these restrictions, social cohesion and acceptance of the restrictions will be crucial. So the fact that people see them as fair and reasonable, and taking into account Trewin's comment that 50%, 40% or so are worried about actually having food on their plate, and the fact that it's clear that we're not all in this together, different people are affected differently. I think this is going to be a huge ongoing debate about whether people are treating fairly. And effectively we've almost got a two-tier employment benefit system emerging, with some people lucky people on furloughs or self-employed getting support versus people on universal benefits. We also, government currently are providing loans to businesses. They don't really work over the long term. So how in this situation can we embed social health and environmental improvements out of the positives, the collaborations that are occurring, and how can they become fixed into maybe institutional forms that then have longer term benefits? I think this is the fundamental challenge. You could talk a lot about this in the food security space, resilient food, but I just pick up one example that's positive, which has historical precedents. We've got Picking for Britain. Could we have Regenerating for Britain? There was a program in the New Deal in the 1930s in the US that exactly did this. It was hugely popular. It was one of the most successful programs in the deep recession. Could this kickstart environmental land management, create the relationships, multi-stakeholder partnerships for managing landscapes, catchments, and could it draw on the people in the food sector or elsewhere who are furloughed, unemployed, and create a huge, both a huge investment in our natural capital for and the sort of environmental basis for our food system, at the same time creating structures that would have long-term benefits. I think that's the possible opportunity, and I know various people are thinking about this. So I'll leave it there for a moment, but happy to obviously respond to questions and so on.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Henry. Yeah, as I said before, it's brilliant to hear economist perspective on this, and that interesting notion of regenerating for Britain, which I'm sure people have views on. What I want to do at this stage, thank you both for that. What I want to do is bring in my co-host Avrilia, who's been keeping an eye on the chat box, which I know has been whizzing around, just to see if there's any kind of questions that we could put to either Henry or Trewin from that initial batch that you've seen. Avrilia, is there anything in there that you've seen you want to pick out?
Yeah, sure. I encourage people to ask more questions. We're a bit more active last time, so feel free to, don't hesitate. Perhaps a question from Trewin. Someone was wondering what is the percentage of people that were fearful for their food security before the crisis, if there is, if you know those measures.
I haven't got comparative data on that, so I can't say what the growth is. I know the Food Foundation did some really interesting research looking at how people are struggling to get food on the table. So I think it's definitely worth checking out the research that the Food Foundation did on this.
Thank you for that. And just a follow-up question from Jennifer. Did your survey include an NI sample?
Yeah, I saw that question. There are two questions on the accuracy of the data. So if people want the raw data, if they just send me the email, I can send you all the data from the survey. We're completely open sourcing it. I'm sort of 99% certain it did include Northern Ireland. But I would need to double check. But it was across the whole of the UK as far as I'm aware. And then somebody said, what about the percentage of people who said that they will continue using the services? What's that percentage of? That was a percentage of the people using those services for the first time. So are they going to keep using the milk delivery service? Are they going to keep using farm deliveries? It was a percentage of those who've shifted their behaviour.
Thank you for that. A few more questions are coming in. A question perhaps for both speakers. How do we see this period changing the way people see supermarkets?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think, people panicked to start with. I think we definitely saw that. And now what we're seeing, and we've spoken to quite a few of the supermarkets, is people have shifted their food routines. So people are going back to much more weekly sort of food shopping. And they definitely seem to be moving or willing to move to some more local producers and suppliers. I think a lot of people, I haven't got hard evidence on this, but anecdotally found that they could get some of the basics that they wanted from their sort of local corner shops. So that, the pasta and tinned tomatoes and everything else that seem to be out of stock in supermarkets. So I think that supermarkets are anticipating there will be some shift, definitely a shift to weekly shopping and potentially a shift to some of the more local suppliers. And I just wanted to reiterate what Henry said about restaurants. Again, all the restaurants that we've been talking to saying if social distancing sticks, it's just not economically viable for them to reopen. And I also spoke to Starbucks, who we have quite a close relationship with, and they're expecting a really big change in habits as well. So, will people really want to queue up in coffee shops for coffee? Their expectation is that people will move much more to pre-ordered click and collect, even for coffees, which was a trend that was starting to happen anyway. So that whole social sort of eating things in public spaces could be really jeopardized by the social distancing.
Thank you, Trewin. Henry, I don't know if you have something else to add on that, but there are a few more questions coming your way as well.
Well, just very quickly on the supermarkets. I think the issue everywhere will be how organisations respond to the immediate needs and requirements of the localities in which they are based. And I think supermarkets have traditionally been very centralised organisations, more a logistics system than actually, in some sense, rather than a food provider. Will the actual supermarkets themselves become more like intelligent, engaged organisations with local communities rather than dumb hubs for a logistics system? I think that's the fundamental challenge they face.
Thank you, Henry. There's a few specific questions for you. I'll start with one which is around how can we practically ourselves as food citizens help support those businesses that have lost 50% of their sales?
Well, how can we help the ones that are going to be restricted, restaurants, bars, etc.? I'm not sure that individually we can help. Obviously, we can support our local restaurants that have become started delivering a takeaway service, but I think it's going to be up to government to look at programs to support the people in these situations. I mean, actually, there is. I think everyone will notice that in the restaurant trade, there's a huge turnover of organisations, sort of anyway, and but in the meantime, people need to within those sectors need to eat.
Thank you for that, Henry. There's a question from someone, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, from someone who is a farmer, and they're mentioning that they're concerned about the current issues in the industry that are being largely ignored. They're saying that there's a huge potential to feed the nation at every price point. And how do we see the true value of food being realized once CAP has gone?
Well, I don't know. I mean, obviously, in a sense, people will realize, you know, when food is short, how important it is. I suppose I'm not a great believer in this idea of creating somehow a true value in the sense of putting numbers on it. I think potentially, hopefully, people will understand more the importance of the systems underlying food, the ecological systems, and so on. If we act to use this opportunity to engage people more in that.
I just add, I think one of the things that might come out of this is that the connection between consumers and food suppliers is going to become quite interesting. I mean, we're already hearing like the dairy industry is having to just get rid of loads of milk, and there's clear wastage there. So I think that there will be there's got to be closer connection between what we're sort of making and growing in this country and consumers. And I think the global picture is going to be super interesting, which is that in the States, a lot of the meat industry in the States is saying their supply chain is pretty close to breaking down at the moment. So you know, what is the global food situation going to be like? And are we going to see sort of in the midterm sort of shortages of food supplies, and what's the impact of that going to be? So I think, who knows, you know, who can predict, but I think it's worth keeping an eye on the global food supply chain, which is going through all the similar sort of shocks that we're facing in the UK.
Thanks both. And potentially taking this a step further, mentioning about the future of our food systems, Roxy is wondering how access to land will impact our potential to build a resilient and regenerative food system. Will we need protection for the land for those who will be creating those shared assets and small, medium scale regenerative practice farming rather than large scale monoculture owned by a few?
Who's that for? I don't know if I can.
Whoever is courageous to respond to that.
I think there were a number of questions about how regeneration, getting a regeneration service or getting people engaged in regeneration might work in practice, and how it might be possible to get political support from that. I think to some extent it's a matter of timing here, because this will not be the first thing that people want to think about. It'll take some time for guidance on restrictions based on risks and so forth to develop. But meanwhile, I would suggest it would be very worthwhile people connecting with potential stakeholders and interesting organizations in this space to get to sort of build the idea. You need, I think, to do this, partnerships of stakeholders in ecosystems. That would obviously include farmers, water companies, but also NGOs, local authorities maybe. And there is a question where this would work best. Some people suggest it might be urban and peri-urban rather than deep in the countryside. And it's reported, I've heard, that farmers and people in the countryside, there's a certain sort of anti-urban, you know, you're the source of where all the problems are, don't come near us. And even people complaining about cyclists coming into the countryside and so on. So there are a number of barriers due to this sort of emerging, I think, gulf between the country and urban environment that will need to be sort of bridged.
I think one of the fundamental questions that we don't know the answer to is, how's the government going to rebuild the economy? So sort of the calls I've had with government this week are talking about shovel-ready projects. So basically, you know, HS2, Heathrow, you know, they see one way of rebuilding the economy is like just sticking money into stuff that's ready to go. And that's one way forward. That would be pretty disastrous. The other way forward is to use this shock as a way of rethinking what a resilient UK and a fairer UK looks like. And that would be things like more urban growing, more resilience to climate change, more resilience to what is sure to be future global supply shocks. You know, that there's likely to be more pandemics in the future. There's likely to be more shocks to the system. So I think all of us probably have sort of a desire and also a voice in this, that we can't let, you know, the easy option, which is go to the shovel-ready stuff, to be the way forward. We've all between us got to somehow create this alternative vision of what a rebuilt economy will look like.
Thank you, Trewin. There is quite a bit of discussion around what you're saying in the chat room, and around that we've gone in the matter of few weeks from talking about climate emergency and responses to that to talking about resilience in business or food systems. I personally think they're all interrelated topics, but it seems that there is potentially a shift away from the climate crisis. How do we bring those, how do you think we can bring effectively the two concepts together and talk about sustainability in food in the future and resilience as one, and generally about climate crisis?
Well, I think you're right. They are one and the same, I think. And the beauty about resilience as a term, although it's a slightly clunky word, is that everybody knows what it means to them personally, whereas sustainability has always been slightly fuzzy around the edges and can be interpreted in so many different ways. So I actually think the shift to a more resilient UK, it plays into the politics well, it plays into the rebuild, but if we get the narrative right, it surely plays into the sustainability agenda, because the sustainability agenda is about a resilient ecosystem. So I think we have to sort of embed the two together. I think the other interesting thing is, more broadly, what we've seen at Hubbub is that the level of interest in single-use plastics has just dropped off the agenda, and actually there's been a sort of counter thing, which is, you know, actually you need sort of more hygiene, and people have started to talk about much more fundamental stuff like climate change, food systems. So I think those are the sort of things that we can build on, because they're actually truly systemic issues we need to deal with.
I think, Verla, you have to start where people are at with the immediate crisis, what is immediately relevant, what are people in people's minds, but by building the relationships and collaborations around those in sort of systems that are relevant to other issues, those wider issues can be brought to the table down the track. And what you've created is new relationships and new possibilities for learning and action that can be truly systemic over the medium and longer term.
Thank you all for that. Can I come back in there, really? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
There's a whole bunch more questions. We're not going to have time to address them all now, but thank you both, Trewin and Henry, for that. I know if there's time later on, we might come back. There's one or two about trade and global trade, etc., which I think are really important. Perhaps we can, if there's time, come back to one or two of those later. But I'm keen to move on to the next batch of speakers. Not a batch makes you sound like a set of units, which you're not. A group of people that we want to hear from in a moment. But I just want to have one last attempt at going back to the Mentimeter that we started before, and some of you have filled in. So this is just an opportunity. If you go to menti.com, if you're not there already, either on a smartphone or browser, and enter the code 525262. So menti.com, menti.com, 525262. And then you should see a question coming up, which is just, where are you? Which many of you have filled in already, which is brilliant. So we expect there to be a strong southeast bias to this because of where we've traditionally run these physical bases. But it's good to see there's quite a few from Scotland, quite a few from southwest England as well, a good spread, some international, which is fantastic. So do just fill that in. I'll get two more quick questions for you in a moment. We'll go through these relatively promptly so we can make sure we hear from our speakers. But this just gives us a sense of where people are in the room, as it were. I'll skip now on to the next question, which is a text entry. You can write this in yourselves. There's no options that you can fill in. Just very briefly, and please keep it concise, who or what is giving you hope at the moment? So the question, who or what is giving you hope at the moment? And hopefully you get opportunity to just put a short bit of text in and that will pop up on the screen as it's starting to do already, what people have. So George Monbiot is the first name that came up, which is interesting. Experts, scientists, nature, the community, charities, Riverford, partnership working, cooking, Nicola Sturgeon, more systemic thinking, spring, which I like, relations, a whole bunch of stuff. I'm not going to attempt to read this out, but we will share this afterwards with you all so you can see this, as we'll share the links, key links that come up through the discussion. We'll share a kind of summary of this with you. So just give you another few seconds just to fill it in, then we'll have one last question before we come into our next batch of speakers. So loads of great stuff in there. All right, last chance to submit that, and then I'll move on to the next one. The community, family, nature, strong themes coming through there. And then the last question for now, which is around the extent to which you agree with some statements. So here you just have to rate it. I think it's 0 to 1 to 10 on the scale. Four separate statements. To what extent do you want food systems to go back to business as usual? To what extent do you want food systems to shift onto a different footing? To what extent do you agree that the current crisis brings opportunities to shift onto a more sustainable path? And finally, to what extent do you think there are risks that business as usual will be further entrenched following COVID-19? So again, strongly disagree through to strongly agree. A low number is strongly disagree with that statement. Strongly agree is a high number. Again, perhaps unsurprising, but the clear trend already coming through that most people on the call don't want to go back to food systems business as usual. Vast majority want to see food systems shifting onto a different footing. And again, we'll come on to, crucially, in the rest of the session a bit more on how we might make that happen. Clearly strong support for opportunities to shift onto a more sustainable path. And I saw a message on the chat box about getting some shovel-ready projects designed and ready. I know there are some already there, but keen to hear thoughts on what some of those might look like. And a reasonable number thinking there are risks that business as usual will be further entrenched. And we heard from the questions before about questions about power of supermarkets, about the role of citizens and what we can do. So there's and to some extent the global situation. So we can come back to one or two of those in the second half. Thank you for that. So I will now go into the second part. And again, I want to really, zoom in on the second half. Think about that different long-term path that I think pretty much everyone on the call wants to see. So how can we make that stick? What can we do? What practical things, what opportunities are people seeing that we can latch onto and try to push harder? Because as one of our council members said the other day, change, the sort of positive change that we want to see is not inevitable. We have to kind of work hard. We have to make it happen. So how can we do that? How can we embed some of that positive change? So we're going to hear from three people. First of all, just briefly from Pete Ritchie, if Aurelia could link in Pete if he's not already. Pete Ritchie, who is Director of Nourish Scotland and a member of Food Ethics Council. So just to give one or two perspectives from Scotland and what he's seeing up there and thoughts on how to embed change. Pete, can Aurelia get Pete in?
Pete, I have unmuted. There you go. You are unmuted now.
Okay, great. Hello, everybody. I'll be brief. So from Scotland, quick update on Scottish Government's approach to this. But before I say that, I think for me, this crisis has brought home the foundational economy as the sort of so important that we have housing, we have food, we have power, we have broadband, and that sort of concept, which I think is relatively new in UK discourse, I think will become much more important as we go forward, because government has a duty to ensure that everybody has access to all those things so they can actually have a decent basic life. And I think the failure of government to ensure some of those things for some people during the crisis is deeply shameful. So the Scottish Government, I think, saw food early, got up to a flying start with food and put £350 million into the Community Food Fund, and has broadly taken a cash-based approach. There have been some hiccups along the way, and certainly the early stuff in our book was a bit too much community, a bit too much voluntary, a bit too much people, the charity sector expected to sort of pick up the pieces for people's food insecurity. We would have liked to have seen a stronger right to food lens from the start in Scottish Government, but obviously particularly in UK Government, where there's been a real neglect of that. So we think that this is a crisis that has been created by government with the best of intentions in terms of people's living standards and opportunities, and with that power comes the responsibility, as somebody was saying earlier, about the social contract, to actually ensure that people have the basics and that they don't have to rely on charity to be able to eat a decent meal every day. Other countries seem to have managed that without any fuss, but for us it seems to be we have to have a sort of weird voluntary effort to try and get food or money to people. We've always had a view that money is where it starts, and that people, if you give people money, they can actually mostly source their own food. There have been difficulties this time, clearly. The other thing Scottish Government, I think, is doing, as with the wider UK Government narrative of Build Back Better that's emerging, they produced a sort of plan for recovery, which is about, well, they're starting to produce a plan which is about specifically being fairer, greener, and more equal. So I think there's some hopes there, although obviously what that looks like in practice we'll have to see. But I think there is a commitment to linking this back up to climate change and the wider just transition agenda. So hopefully we won't go back to business as usual, at least not immediately. I want to talk just really about 3 points of connection briefly that I've seen in our work here in Scotland, because very much this has been about physical distancing, but for a lot of people actually it's been about social connection rather than social distancing. And I think the 3 connections we've seen, first of all, about this connection to local food. People have had to ask themselves the question, well, where does food come from when it doesn't come from Tesco? And that massive surge in the local food economy, we've seen at home, our sales are up 400% in terms of deliveries. We've shut our physical farm shop, so we've had to deliver, but it's been an extraordinary increase in sales. lots of people saying, I want to buy food from my mum who's not well, my dad who's not well, my sister who's not well. I'm living in London, but can you deliver it to them because I'm worried about them? So there's been that food as care bit of it, but also people thinking, you know, we'd like to support what you're doing. How long that will last, we don't know, but we've had sort of appreciation that we've never experienced before from customers, and lots and lots of support, and people appreciating that connection. I got my first tip delivering food the other day, which is great. The other second connection is about food as community, and what we've seen from the local food sector, community food sector, the people who've been typically doing community meals and community growing, as they found ways to keep the connections with people. So people have been, you know, having meals together online, they've been sowing seeds together online, they've been actually doing some of the things that they were doing as communities before, but keeping that sense of community going. So I think that's been a really important connection that we've seen. And I suppose the third connection, which is obviously on social media particularly, is food and nature. You know, I think spring doesn't really know we've got a COVID emergency, and lambs get born and the dung gets spread and the seeds get sown. And that sense of, particularly in Scotland where you've got a strong rural connection, people are sort of very much aware that, you know, it's the season starting, and that people have to start growing things, and people are going to have to start picking things soon. So that reconnection of food and the seasons, I think, has been quite strong. So I suppose to sum some of that up, what we want to see going forward is a major pivot towards local food economy, both in the National Food Strategy and in Scotland's Good Food Nation plans. I think it's been hard to advocate for that in some quarters, because people say, well, where's the evidence? It's better for the environment, it's better for climate change, local food can be more expensive, blah, 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 blah. But actually, once the zeitgeist shifts, then the evidence gets found, because people start doing things rather than not doing them. So I think there's potential to really shift local and regional food economies. And this isn't actually about self-sufficiency. It's about rewiring the way that we do food. Most farmers still produce commodities rather than food. And a lot of the supply chains that used to exist post-war have simply been atrophied because of the supermarket dominance. You know, breaking the milk delivery was the first thing the supermarkets did in the 60s. Restructuring that and making that financially, economically viable, producing good livelihoods, is going to take more than a bit of goodwill from customers. It's going to take investment and restructuring, and probably some new financial models too. But at the core of the local food economy is relationship. And this is fundamentally as much about people as it is about ploughing. So I think that's probably all I need to say at the moment, if that's okay. But I suppose, yeah, just finally, all of this building back better in our book is dependent not just on what individual national governments do, but there has to be an international deal on debt cancellation, because I think without that, we're all going to be in hot to the finance community for the next 10 years, and all our good intentions will come to nothing. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you. And very important to bring that international dimension as well, which got raised before. We haven't managed to dive into too much, to make sure we're not thinking of this as a bubble, as an island conversation. Next we've got Jyoti. Thank you, Pete, for that. Jyoti's been very patiently waiting on the phone because she is having access problems. So hopefully Jyoti can hear us. Jyoti from Landworkers Alliance.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes. So thank you, Jyoti.
Oh, great. Okay, unmuted.
We'd love to hear what you think about what you've heard about, you know, what resilience means to you, and what sort of immediate practical actions and long-term recovery actions, if you like, that we might need in order to shift onto that better footing. But over to you, Jyoti.
Okay. Yeah, I come from the Landworkers Alliance. We're a union of small and medium and family farms and community farms. And we're part of La Via Campesina, which is an international farmers union for small farmers around the world, about 200 million small farmers who've all been facing quite huge problems with distribution of food and getting crops in the ground and things like that throughout this crisis, but really kind of illustrating at the same time how resilient the agroecological farms that we all are can be, in that, you know, they're smaller, they're more diverse, they can be doing one thing and then switch very rapidly to doing something else and really respond to what needs to happen. Like in the UK, I think it was mentioned somewhere just how much the box schemes have increased. There was a survey that the Food Foundation put together of all the box schemes, because, you know, we immediately as a union started getting all these calls from producers who had lost restaurant sales and event sales, and we're trying to figure out how to rapidly change their sales models at the same time as planting season, you know, trying to determine what they should be planting and how, you know, how much of what they should be planting and where to get the finance from to change very quickly their sales models. And box schemes have gone up by 113% in England and Wales. And, you know, that just gives some indication of just how quickly these box schemes were able to shift. And also, like, the other thing that's been happening is just the wider society seems to have such a huge awareness of how important food is and how important a domestic food supply. People are feeling pretty vulnerable. You know, they don't know if crops are getting in the ground elsewhere. They don't know if, you know, the migrant workers, even in other countries, are able to get to the crops to get stuff in the ground. And people are realizing, you know, as much as we can, sometimes it's just the feeling of self-sufficiency, feeling you've got some control over the situation, and knowing that, you know, we have a way to respond. Yeah, people are just feeling like that, but at the same time, really wanting to support a transition in how stuff is farmed. And because we're agroecological farmers, and, you know, we farm environmentally friendly ways and try and sell things direct to customers and locally, we'd really like to see that transition pick up, because, you know, we will need more jobs in this transition. And, you know, as jobs in other sectors go down, and it might be in the leisure industry or in the restaurant trade or whatever it is, we can create a lot more jobs in food and farming. You know, if you do things more agroecologically, you need more people doing those jobs. You need more people weeding and picking and selling and distributing and processing. And those are jobs that, if they can be valued and invested in properly, they can be well paid. They can be pleasant. You know, you know, if you're trying to pick on huge farms and not very well paid, working very long hours, and the job can be jobs can be really repetitive and a lot of strain, then they're very, you know, it's hard to recruit people for those jobs. They can be taxing on your body and on your mental health. But, you know, if you can scale farms down so they're more human scale, so that the jobs are respected, so that the jobs are well paid, then, you know, we can recruit a lot of people into those jobs, and people really enjoy being outside and doing a bit of physical work. So it's about thinking about those transitions, about how we can create more jobs in the food and farming sector that people want to do. So as a union, what we've been trying to encourage agricultural departments to do is put some money into this transition, especially for small scale farms that have historically not really benefited from the cap payments as much as the larger farms. There's been a lot of investment into, like, the bigger supply chains, you know, increasing the efficiency of larger farms, but not so much in the smaller ones. We're saying, well, actually, let's invest a bit more into farms that are delivering public goods and farms that are supplying food directly to, you know, get it to people who need access to food. So we were looking at something that's called a supply chain transition fund. We've been lobbying DEFRA to do, which would do things like help transition some farms towards direct sales models, help get more people producing vegetables, helping diversify farms so that they're growing more than one thing on a farm and have a load of different things going on, so that, you know, the jobs can be more varied, and supporting, like, you know, worker rights, so that those jobs are good. Also, we've been asking them about doing a community resilience fund, because that is to try and address this access to food issue. Somebody asked earlier how many people in a state of food insecurity. Our organization did a people's food policy a while back. And at that time, when we put out our people's food policy, there were reports saying there were 8 million people in England who are in such a state of financial precarity that they couldn't afford to eat well. And there was a UNICEF report launched that said 1 in 5 children were food insecure. Now, I don't know about this. That was a few years back, but I mean, I don't think that situation has changed that much. And it's certainly gotten worse through this crisis situation, with more people losing income, with so many of these supply chains being so precarious to the areas where there's, you know, where the physical access to food, you know, where you can't actually get to a place that's selling fresh fruit and veg, or markets have closed, which might be a lifeline for people in the middle of cities, you know, from some communities needing to get fresh fruit and veg, and that sort of thing. So we felt like more investment needs to go into supply chains that directly look at how smaller scale agroecological farms, family farms, our local food economy can address the access to food issue. In a way, because it's been left to the market by our government, because there hasn't been right to food legislation, that there hasn't been a stress on the importance of government to intervene to allow affordable access to good food for all. A lot of the farms doing this right now have had to address the niche market, to look at selling to the middle class and to fancy farmers markets, because they haven't had that financial support and quite often not the cap payments to help support their marketing models in order to stay going, doing what they're doing. That's really good. But if there was some state intervention that helped set up these farms that could address this issue, if you got a lot more peri-urban and urban farms, and people within disadvantaged communities supported to get training and access to land to be able to supply food within their own communities themselves, then we can get a much stronger, fairer model for resilience in our food system. And I think a lot of investment needs to go into building those models. And a lot of investment needs to go into getting new entrants into farming. If you want shovel-ready people, we've got the shovel-ready people, really. We know so many people who want a job that's ecological, that has meaning in society, that's rewarding, and you get, direct immediate contact with your customers and you feel good about supplying good, healthy food to them. But they need access to land, they need training, they need stimulus packages. We just did a survey and we've already, just in the last week, found 150 new entrants ready to go, this year. If they had the land and the access to the resources to get started, they'd be producing our domestic food supply for us, and government needs to invest in that and take that very seriously. There's a huge problem with distribution of land, a huge problem with access to the resources for people to get training and to get started. And, if we're going to take right to food seriously and build up a green transition, then government needs to invest now.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jyoti. That was fantastic to have a whistle stop through a whole bunch of stuff. I won't try and repeat it all, but I like including lots of concrete suggestions, things like the supply chain transition funds, and I like that phrase, having lots of shovel-ready people ready to go.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jyoti, for that. So we'll come back. We'll come next to Corinna Hawkes. Many of you will know Professor Corinna Hawkes from Centre for Food Policy. Corinna, just to, I guess, with your food policy hat, but thinking and helping us join some of those dots for long-term resilience. What should we be pushing for in terms of policy and more broadly? What would you be recommending?
Sure. I wanted to start. Can you hear me? Okay. I wanted to start by supporting the points that have been made about resilience rather than sustainability as the word moving forward. And while one has to be careful about buzzwords, I do think resilience is an important and extremely useful term that perhaps we should have been using more previously. The second, I wanted to pick up on the point that was made about the fact that demand for food will continue, and therefore food will be seen as a sector with opportunities in it. Remembering that the economic crisis that we all face is unusual. Most financial and economic crises are brought about and the normal cycle of capitalism, where crises are just a normal part of capitalism and are to be expected, and they're generated internally as a function of the financial system that we have. Whereas this crisis was generated externally by cutting consumption and forcing the reduction, rapid reduction in consumption. But of course, food is an exception to that, and food will continue to be an exception to that. People might still buy less of certain things, but they will still continue to buy food, and that gives us an opportunity. And so when it comes to resilience, then what this whole crisis provides the opportunity for is a focus on resilience, and secondly, a focus on food. So it's a tremendous opportunity for resilience in the food system. And when we're talking about resilience, I think we have to be clear what we're talking about. As someone said earlier, people have a sense of what it is they're talking about. But what I'm talking about here is the capacity of the food system to ensure all people are eating healthy diets, or the capacity of systems to ensure all people are eating healthy diets and are secure in the diets that they have, while supporting decent, fair livelihoods, our nature and society in the face of shocks and stresses. And so when we're thinking about resilience, one of the things that needs to be mentioned right away is the importance of diversity as an aspect of resilience. Because what we've seen is the increasing specialisation in the food system, which means there is less diversity in the food system in terms of the people in it, the businesses in it, and so on. If we are to highlight and advocate, as I believe we should, diversity as a core function, a core aspect of resilience, that means diverse businesses, diversity in supply chains, diversity in sources of food, diversity of skills. It's not just the caterers and the supermarkets that can prepare our food, but we want those skills to be spread with people who learn how to cook, and so on. So the more diverse a system, the greater its ability to respond. And so when we're looking at these different aspects of resilience, we need to ask, right, where do we need to start to create this resilience? And I go back to this diagram which we produced at the Centre for Food Policy, which lists the different dimensions of the food system. And we need to find resilience in all of those different dimensions. So that means that the first part to start with health, we've seen from the coronavirus that if people aren't healthy, they are more prone to suffer from complications of the virus. And so that suggests that an important component of resilience will be healthy eating for all. A second thing that we've seen is the fact that so many economic operators are operating at the margins. And so a resilient system is when we're not just working on such tiny margins. Thirdly, political resilience. We need flexibility in decision-making structures. That has important implications for new food governance. Fourthly, around social resilience. We've seen that if you live in a community where there is a lot of connections in that community, you're more likely to get what you need and be supported. That's the social aspect of resilience. And finally, environmental resilience, of course, which is crucial for all kinds of reasons, but which the coronavirus has shown that if we don't have a resilient ecosystem, then that can actually manifest itself in the greater onset of these kind of infectious diseases. So what then do we need is practical steps. We need three things. My argument is that they should focus on assets and be positively focused, because the current situation is an absolute unique opportunity to assess where there has been resilience in the system, to look at positive deviance, if you like, and to say, in this crisis, let's look at where there has been resilience at all different pinch points along the food supply chain and in all of those different dimensions. So the first thing we should do is a food systems resilience audit of where has been resilient in the system, and report on that and record that. The second thing we need to do is to say, well, where there has been resilience in the system, why is that? What are the policies that have enabled that to happen? What do the economics look like? What is the system? And then to say, and then if we can learn from where there has been resilience in the system, how can we then use policy to scale that up and scale that out? And then the third thing that we need to do is a bit more of a grand plan when it comes to policy and looking at food policy. And all the political emphasis at this point in time is going to be on the government rebuilding the economy. That point was made earlier. What is this economy is going to look like? We know that food is still going to be demanded, and we know that this new food system that we want it to be resilient, we want it to be diverse. So then we need an economic plan for food, an explicitly economic plan for food, but one which also explicitly creates resilience in the way that I articulated earlier with diet, society, environment, and so on. And building on, and the aspects of that plan will come from what has been learned about what has proved resilient in the food system already. And that will be something that we can, I don't know where this shovel ready, oven ready kind of stuff comes in, but that's something that we can present and say, look, you want some economic boosting in this economy. This is what's resilient. This is what can supply the demand for food. And this actually is an economic plan for British food, an economic plan for Britain, which is actually essentially about renewing the resilience of our food system. So there are the 3 practical steps that I think we need in order to create that longer term resilience in the food system.
Brilliant. Thank you, Corinna. That was fantastic. Lots there, diversity, and some great suggestions on what we need to do to really learn from what's happening at the moment and build resilience right across the board. We've got about 15 minutes left. What I want to do is spend 10 minutes of that just with questions and responses to the key contributors, speakers we've just heard from. And then we'll have 5 minutes at the end, which will be really important for you to stay to, where we'll give you an opportunity to go back to Mentimeter, and we'll just do a quick wrap up. And I'll, at that point, while we're doing that, just to pre-warn the 5 speakers, if they're still on here, is to just ask them for that. What's their kind of one takeaway message they want people to go away with? That's the sort of last thing. You know, how can we make things stick? What's your kind of one practical thing that people can do, either as individuals and food citizens, or wearing the hats that they are, many hats that many people wear. So hand over to Avrilia first. So just for 10 minutes or so, just for a handful of questions to Corinna, Jyoti, and Pete. So Avrilia, over to you.
Thanks, Dan, and thank you everyone for contributing. Before I go back to the point around the global food system that Dan, you mentioned, I'm just going to make some questions that are relevant to what our speakers were discussing. There was a lot of discussion in the comments around how this gives an opportunity for recalibrating our food system and our relationship with it. So a lot of people mentioned food education in schools, that the food budget needs to be an investment on well-being rather than just something we have to spend weekly. The fact that we need to start seeing workers in the supply chain as essential workers rather than unskilled people. And how this could bring back a connection to the land, moving away from automation of the supply chain. So a few questions that came based on that is, I think there's a clear need and want to move towards community and rural supply chains. However, we've been seeing that there's a lot of difficulties in the current situation. For example, in some areas, Charlotte mentioned that in some areas, actually the big supermarkets have dominated for some reasons, being that they're quite cheap, or that the local shops are just not close to people's homes. And so what can we do if we are meeting with local organizations and local governments? What can we do about convincing them to build local food resilience? And also, how can we push governments to ensure resilience in the training of, in the community farming and the training of farm workers?
Thank you, brilliant. Jyoti, did you want to come in on that first?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, we have really seen a lot of the investment the government's already putting in being possibly, we don't know, but directed towards the supermarket chain and to models like, fair share, where they'll be buying, excess produce off of the larger farms and distributing the food banks. Now, that's one thing that can be done, but actually some of that money should be going towards investment and in reactions to this crisis that are actually fostering those resilient networks. So, in some places where there's not supermarkets, there could be investment in delivery systems that ones that are being set up where there's online delivery systems and they collate the produce from smaller farms and then take it directly to people's homes. Or if markets are kept open, if there's some advice from the local council how to keep the open air markets open so that people can actually still go to them and socially distance, then that can help with that. It depends on every area, and everywhere is going to have a local solution, but it's really thinking about how they can build those networks in a different way and asking for a share of the budget that's there to try and create these solutions, not just to go to the supermarket model and to the larger farm model and intervening in that, but trying to build more resilient models of how to do this type of thing. And then the second question, what was the second one? Sorry.
I think it was the similar question, how can we encourage them to include, the government to include more young farmers in the supply chain as well?
Yeah, well, I think it's really just thinking about investment because, I mean, you know, there's new entrant startup grants that we've been lobbying for quite a long time. In Scotland's had those, and various places across Europe have them, but England never has gone there. And that would make an enormous difference to have startup grants for young farmers trying to get into farming. And often the people trying to get into farming come out with a really fresh mindset, you know, of what they want to do with it in very creative ways. If we want that diversity, if we want that resilience, and particularly if you want people from different backgrounds going into it, then there's got to be investment, because it can't just be people who have inherited money and then go invested in a farm or taking some of their, you know, previous like inherited land and trying to change it. It's got to be people coming from backgrounds and from communities where they need good access to food, being enabled to do that. And that will take investment, because it's, you know, there's a historical injustice in the fact that, you know, lots of people don't have the same amount of money as other people. Lots of people haven't had the same amount of training as other people. Sometimes people don't have the savings to go and volunteer on farms in order to learn skills or to be able to access, you know, even a very small plot on the edge of a city to be able to provide food for their own community. You know, that's got to be invested in and taken very seriously, because there's so many people who want to do this and want to be inspired to have the skills to be able to set up something that's sustainable within their own community, you know, knowing the culture of that area, knowing the people in that area, having those connections, but they've got to be invested in, and that investment has to be financial investment and facilitation of getting them access to land, whether it's councils finding them land, you know, land being granted, it could be through the planning system, whatever it is. But unless we have that proactive recruitment and support, it's not going to happen.
Thank you, Jyoti. Brilliant. Can I jump in and ask Corinna a question, one of the questions? Is that okay? Corinna, one of the questions that came up was, which I like, was do you have examples of resilient success stories that you've seen? And before I let you answer that, just worth flagging to people that haven't seen it. So the RSA, Food Farming Countryside Commission, has got their Road to Renewal website, which Tom McMillan is overseeing. So roadtorenewal.co.uk. They're trying to capture their stories of how people are responding and adapting to COVID-19 crisis. The link to food. So just shout out for that. But Corinna, so yeah, what sort of anything jump to mind in terms of examples of resilient success stories that you've come across so far?
Well, we're going to be looking at this a little bit at the Centre for Food Policies Initiative, the Food Research Collaboration, and I'm very excited by the work that the Commission is doing also on this road to renewal, so we can identify particular examples. So we're going to be doing that, and I would look to many people on this call, for example, who have their own examples, but perhaps they haven't framed it in that way. And I think there is a job to be done to make it clear what resilience actually looks like. So I can't share with you a very specific example, but what I will say is that I mentioned diversity earlier, that it could very well be argued that there has been a certain amount of resilience shown in the system, in the sense that there isn't resilience at the consumer end because of poverty, and that is a very clear sign, but that food still is being delivered, and that of course then leads into the idea that supermarkets are doing all of these wonderful things. But what it does indicate is that there are aspects of the current system which are showing some resilience. Now, is that resilience being created because there are kind of false supports, as it were, or is it actually a sign that there are some things that we can learn from the past about some strengths in the system? And so I think we need to keep an open mind about what we're talking about here, and accept that we're not talking about one system or another, but about a system of systems where there is diversity in that system. So I can't really answer your question very satisfactorily, I'm afraid, with specific examples. But I do think that by framing the questions right, there should be a process of trying to identify what those examples are, and we'll certainly be doing our part of that in the Food Research Collaboration. Brilliant.
Thanks, Corinna. That's fantastic to hear. And I guess what I want to do just in the last few minutes, and please do stay for the last few minutes because there's still some important stuff to get through. I guess I want to do a quick round. Sorry, we haven't got time to address all the multiple questions that have come through. Thank you very much for everyone many of you or all of you on the call could have acted as contributors. I know there's lots of fantastic expertise across everyone joining. I just wanted to, before we kind of close, do 2 or 3 things. One was just go around the speakers we've heard from already, just to have your final one takeaway message. I say, so what's the sort of one thing in terms of how we make things stick, how we rebound onto that fairer, more resilient footing, more diversity at the heart of it, perhaps. What's your kind of one bit of advice for people, or what's your one takeaway from the discussion? And please keep that quite brief if you can. And then what we'll do is just get people to an opportunity to go back to Mentimeter, share a few final thoughts and evaluations, and also bring in Anna very briefly, my colleague. So if we go around one at a time, so just brief responses. What's the kind of one your one takeaway message you want people to go away with? We start maybe with Jyoti on the phone.
Am I off mute?
Yes,
Hello?
you are.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay. I would say that, since this is for food citizens, the thing I would say is, yes, shop local and really support your choices, your choices and stick with them. But more than that, lobby as a food citizen that we have a right to have a food system where the government intervenes. Food's not a business like any other. If we want people to start these resilient, fantastic farms, then the government needs to intervene, and we have a right to food that should be supported by government. So get out there and lobby for a better food system. You have a right to demand a better food system, and do it.
Great, thank you, Jyoti. Very powerfully put. Perhaps if we go Henry and then Trewin, Corinna, and then finish with Pete, if that makes sense. Just to give, so Henry next, and then what's your brief reaction, Henry?
Well, my main message is seek to turn the new collaborations that have emerged to address the current challenges into new structures, new institutions, which outlast the current crisis.
Thank you. Very clearly and very important point. Thank you, Henry. Trewin next.
I think it comes back to that resilience point, and I think what we need to do is we need to join up a lot of the conversations we've heard today, linking it to health, obesity, access to food, and a more environmentally resilient system. And we've somehow got to make that incredibly strong. Otherwise, we'll just go back to what we had before.
Thank you, Trewin. Corinna, and we'll come on to Pete after. Corinna.
So my message, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
So my message is to think positive and think big. Positive in the sense of looking for these positive examples and making a conscious and purposeful effort to do so. And also to think big by aligning with current political concerns about rebuilding our economy and fully understanding the role that a resilient, healthy and sustainable food system can have in actively contributing to that.
Great, thank you, Corinna. And finally, Pete, are you still there, Pete?
Yep. Hi, Dan. So I agree with Jyoti. We need to pivot to a local food economy based on the right to food and not the disgraceful two-tier food system that we have in this country at the moment. And if I could just finish with an example of resilience. We're off this afternoon to pick up 90 bags of flour from Angus McDowell at Mungo's Wells, who farms organic wheat and reconstituted an old Swiss Army mill on his farm to produce flour for baking. We also have sourdough sachets from Andrew Whitley, which means you can reconstitute your own sourdough whenever you want. And on Angus's farm, there's a big notice up saying, please be patient with us. We're doing as much as we can. We have plenty of wheat. There is plenty of wheat in the UK, but the supermarkets and even the local shops run out of flour because we're not resilient. And we use more land in the UK to grow biofuels on using wheat than we do for fruit and vegetables. So change is possible.
Thank you, Pete. In the last 2 minutes, what I want to do is bring in my colleague Anna, if you're there, Anna, in a second. While I'm doing that, I'll get Anna to talk whilst I'm sharing the screen to Mentimeter again. People can just do the last couple of questions on Mentimeter, and then I'll just quickly wrap up. So I will hand to Anna just on a brief reflection or how that links to work that we're doing, Anna.
Yes, hi, can everybody hear me? Great, thank you so much. It's so much to capture. So just so everybody knows, what we'll do as a team is I'll go away and collect the wisdom that has been shared, both by the speakers, but also I will go back to the chat room as well and listen to what has been said as well. I haven't been able to follow that during the call. I'm really glad to hear resilience as an ecologist. I think that's absolutely crucial. We have talked a little bit about resilience in our previous food talk, which I recommend listening to, specifically how we can talk about resilience, and Corinna's definition was very helpful. The point on diversity is crucial, and what I would be interested in looking forward is how, if the current forces that were at play until now drove everything to a monoculture and sort of a completely undiverse landscape in the food system, what are the opposite drivers? What are the things that drive diversity across the system? I think that's the question that I think we could hold. And I really like the point, Henry's point on we should go where the energy is and listen to the positive stories. In some way, this is where some of our work at the Food Ethics Council has been about. So we've been working on this idea of food citizenship, and we've already identified some key ingredients of food citizenship, which I would argue are also key ingredients to build resilience, which is the language that we use and how we frame things, the importance of connection and local communities, and also the importance of empowering people. And we've got lots of ideas on how people are already doing this. So if you go to foodcitizenship.info, and in terms of examples of positive things happening in the system, we'll also share this either on Twitter or through our newsletter. So if this interests you, welcome to join us on that platform. And that's where I'll leave it. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone.
Great, thanks, Anna. And just in the last 1 minute we've got left, the question that was asked about things that you've seen that you'd like to keep COVID. I've had loads of suggestions there. I'll share this rather than read them out now. We'll share this with you in a follow-up afterwards. But loads of great suggestions there. The last two questions are to see what kind of insight have you taken away from the discussion today. Would love you just to. What's the kind of key message you've heard that you want to chip in and feed in? So again, this is on the menti.com, if you can, on the browser, which hopefully most of you have still got open. What insight have you taken from today's food talks? And hopefully, if it's working, things should pop up on the screen in the next few moments. So what insight have you taken from today's food talks? If that may or may not be working, and just give it a few seconds. No, okay. Well, while I'm just trying to get that to work, just by way of close, a huge thank you to everyone for joining. In particular, to our answers are popping up, which is great. A huge thank you to all our 5 speakers: Jyoti, Corinna, Henry, and Trewin. Big thanks to Aurelia and Anna for helping. As I said, we'll share notes in the coming next couple of days. And just to pick out a couple of things, more things people raised on that we haven't talked about. One is basic income, which has been suggested, just to say that Food Ethics Council is going to be running a food policy on trial on that at some point in the next couple of months. We'd love people to participate in that. And then the next food talks we'll be running one. We're planning on 21st of May. We'll send details around shortly, which is picking up on something that was talked about earlier. How can we make sure that we don't lose sight of the other critical emergencies we're facing, the climate emergency, nature emergency, obesity crisis, etc.? How can we keep both the short-term lens and tackle the very urgent issues, but keep some of those longer-term emergencies, make sure that we are making progress on those at the same time. So thank you everyone for joining. The last slide, if you have it on Menti, is just a talk extension with some statements relating to today's session. Do you feel as though you've learned something new? Do you feel part of the community and feel motivated to do something as a result of being engaged in the conversation today? And it's been fantastic to have well over 250 people at different points engaged in the conversation. We've scratched the surface. I feel we could have had a huge, much longer conversation, but it's been really enriching, and certainly some practical and inspiring actions from people that I'll take away. So I'll just give you a few moments to fill in that last survey box. And with that, once you've done that, a big thank you. Keep safe and well, and crucially resilient. And there is a lot we can do to make things stick and to rebound onto that different path. And for me, as I said, reiterate the point I made earlier, that that it's not inevitable that we'll bounce back onto a shiny new better planet going forward and a better food systems. We need to work hard and we need to work together, and the likes of Sustain, obviously partners on this, and others critically involved in that. So yeah, do get involved, do stay resilient, and look forward to seeing you hopefully at the next Food Talks. Take care, everyone. Thanks all. And as people are dialing off, we will share, as I said, we'll share notes. We will pick out key bits in the chat box, as Anna said, and we will be sharing this recording more publicly in a couple of days' time. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining from lots of different parts of the country and indeed the world. It's been brilliant to see and hear from many of you, and look forward to staying in touch. With that, we will close things down. Anna will, Aurelia will make sure we've captured the chat function, save those details, and we'll end the recording at that point. Thank you all.